if you want to be a artist that makes his own comics, tells stories, want to get into storyboarding, or just make illustrations that tell a story, this video is going to massively help you. The reason I say that is because in my 8 years as a professional artist, understanding how lenses work has drastically helped me into telling stories. And I can promise you that by the end of this video, you'll have a much better idea of why you need to understand lenses, how you'll be able to use it, and how you can apply it in your own art. It's going to be a bit of a longer video, this one, because I am going to go through the entire classroom that I gave at Artwod. Let's get into it right away. We'll start with, why do we have different lenses? So for those of you that don't understand what I'm talking about when it comes to lenses, we're talking about camera lenses, the invention of the camera and the invention of lenses that go on top of a camera. Lenses give us literally a different perspective on how we view the environment that the camera is looking at. And this happens in a myriad of ways. There are hundreds of lenses, and we're not going to cover all of them. We're basically going to cover three major groups: the wide-angle lens, the standard lens, and the long lens. Because honestly, these three are almost everything you need. Anything in between, especially from an artist point of view, is not necessary. This is more for cinema and videography itself. Here on the canvas, I have some examples of the three kinds of lenses and what they represent. And I'm going to go through them one by one so you can get a better understanding of how you can interpret these lenses, the use of these lenses, and how they can already help you understand why you need to be aware of them when you create your art. Now, it's a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on lenses. This is just from my observation and what I see and love about cinema. There are many different uses for lenses, but I feel like if you, for your own development and for your own progress, if you categorize things, it's easier to then experiment within a certain category. Wide-angle lenses, why do we use them? Well, when it comes to wide-angle lenses, the thing that they give us is they give us this sort of spectator feeling. A spectator feeling that we can see the thing in the image, the thing on the screen, as larger than life. It literally has a sort of magical feeling because it is a fictional representation of life. But that's the idea of it. Now, a wide-angle lens gets used for a couple of things. It gets used for what they call establishing shots. Maybe at the beginning of a scene or the beginning of a movie, you'll get an establishing shot of New York, let's say. That is a wide-angle lens is used there because they want to give you a lot of information, and I'll cover that later. But what's also really cool about a wide-angle lens is that it can combine the emotion of a character or the detail of a character up close while still giving you enough information of everything around it. And this is what other lenses can't really do. So, for instance, if you have this close-up shot or this close-up shot or this close-up shot, right? They're all very close up. If you do that with a regular lens or even with your own eyes and you're this close to someone, it's very hard to see everything else around it. So what a wide angle lens does, it still gives you all of that information in the scene so that you can get a very informed view of where the character or whatever it is you're trying to put in focus is, so that you still get enough information about its surroundings. The same thing here. It's not a close-up of a character, but it's like we can literally pack every single one of these characters in the same frame and still show you that the subject at hand is in the back of a trunk. And so a wide-angle lens can give you a lot of information about the scene we're in. If we then go to something like a standard or a medium lens, this is primarily used to give you almost like a participating view in the scene, meaning that because a standard lens is very close to our eyes, it's like our eyes have been assessed to be around a 50 to 60 millimeter lens. Now, of course, eyes work completely different because they're dual focused, but still, it's like very close to what we see in real life, which means that if they use a standard or medium lens, or a lot of the times it get used to give us a feeling that we are participating in the scene because it's very close to how we view the world. And by doing that, we can also feel like if we're watching a scene, that we as the audience are participating in the scene. So we get to see like almost like we're at the bar with this character, we're at the bar or we're at the pool with this character. We're really witnessing the conversation between the two characters in the screen ourselves, like we're standing behind the shoulder of this character in the scene, and we are actively participating or at least witnessing the conversation itself. Same with, this scene from Saving Private Ryan. So a standard to medium lens is really, really effective in helping us pull in the audience into the scene. So if you want to create scenes, or if you want to draw a scene that is very immersive for the audience, and you want to convey emotion, and you also want them to feel like they're part of the scene, then you want to use like a standard medium lens. I mean, these are all suggestions, but you can see how the understanding of lenses really comes in handy when you want to build your own scenes, or you want to build your own stories, or you want to create an illustration that has storytelling elements. Now, lastly, in these three categories that I'm going to show you, we have the long lens. Now, what is a long lens? Well, the long lens is basically where we take a really zoomed out view of a scene, and the camera is really far away, but it's zoomed into the scene. So that's why it's a long lens, and I'll give you an illustrated view of that a bit later. But what a long lens does is it really creates a more 2D version of a scene. The reason for this is that because the long lens has a really long distance to travel and its focal length is very narrow, it really compresses everything in the frame. So compared to if we look at the wide angle, we can see a lot of depth going on. We can see a lot of room and a lot of detail in the scene. Whereas with a long lens, we have to zoom in on one particular thing, and there's not a lot for us to then still witness from this scene. It's like only that focal point, and that's it. Everything else is either blurry or simply not visible because the lens cannot pick it up. And so what this does is that the long lens is used to create a more filmic effect, actually. So this is why directors like Wes Anderson, they really like the use of the long lens, or sometimes they do a combination between long and wide to give a very graphic feeling and a graphic nature to the film, which creates, again, a more fictional aesthetic to the scene, to the film. What this also does, and you'll hear a lot of directors say this, is because we're compressing everything, right? We do this for YouTube as well. Because we're compressing, we're using a long lens, right? I cannot reach the lens. You can see that. I'm stretching my arm, and I'm nowhere near the lens. So we're compressing everything within the frame. And that means that your subject matter usually becomes graphically more appealing. So a lot of directors will say, like, when you want to make an actor more attractive, you use a long lens because it will make things seem more graphic, more compressed. There's less room for irregularities that your eye can pick up because we're compressing everything, right? So it's a very much an emphasis on a graphic tone for your scene. So when it comes to the different lenses, I categorize it as follows. When you have a wide angle, there's usually an action or an interaction where the emotion is in relationship to the surrounding. So if you're very close to a subject, you can still look at its emotion or its interaction with the rest of the environment. Even when it's an establishing shot, there's usually an interaction with the surrounding, or there's a lot of information thrown at you. That's why if we go from the left to the right, you can see that the wide angle lens will be much more prone to information, where long lens will be more prone to graphic nature. And so when we go from the wide angle to the long lens now, is that the long lens will really be used for like drama and appeal, and it will be emotion in relation to the situation or others. So there will be a lot more emphasis on the graphic nature of the scene. And when we look at the standard medium, it's all about connection, right? It's about the emotion in relationship to others. And so we're slowly always moving from a very informative view to a very graphic view. And at the end of this, I'm gonna show you in practical terms how this would work in the same illustration so that you can see how you can use that in your own illustration and storytelling. That said, when we look at lens comparisons in general, And we have to give credit where credit's due because this is almost directly inspired by the book Framed Perspective from Mathieu Mestre, which is a fantastic book, and I would recommend anyone to get this. This is a very good graphic explanation of what the difference is between a wide angle, a standard, and a long lens. So the wide angle is, as you can see, is that the camera can be very, very close to the subject matter. So this is your subject matter. And so the camera is able to get very, very close because it casts a wide angle. So it can capture a wide angle of that subject matter. And if you look at the standard and medium, it has to have a bit more distance because the angle, it's all about the angle, is a little bit narrower. Therefore, it has to take a bit of distance for it to capture that same subject matter. And then when it comes to the long lens, it's a very narrow angle, so it has to have a lot of distance to capture the same subject matter. And so to give you a bit of jargon when it comes to lenses, like you have focal length, and the focal length is basically the distance between the lens and the subject matters in the scene that the camera can still keep focus. So keeping focus means that I'm sharp in the image, and for instance, even this is already a bit more blurry than me because that the focal length for a long lens is very short. It's very narrow. It can only focus on this. So everything else in the scene, right, whatever subject or things that are here will be very, very blurry. Whereas if you look at the wide angle, anything here would still be relatively sharp. And that's why it's an informative angle. That's why you can get really up close, but you can also see a lot of stuff. Now, it doesn't only have to do with focal length. It's also the type of lens that can give more what they call bokeh versus other lenses. But all in all, a wide angle lens or standard will have more focal length than a long lens. So this is this is good to understand because when you want to like replicate a certain feeling of a lens in your 2D illustration, because you're not using a camera, right? You're using your own 2D drawings, is that you can basically give the illusion of a long lens or a wide angle lens by the fact that you're putting certain things in focus and other things out of focus. And so understanding this, it will give a more cinematic feeling to your illustrations if that is what you're going for. Okay, so now let's look at the correlation between perspective and lenses because I feel this is such a missed opportunity for artists that they don't investigate this. And this is what I always talk about when it comes to making your own puzzle pieces. I'm always trying to figure things out. And I feel as an artist, that is what you should do. Figuring things out, problem solving, will give you more tools in your tool bag to create more interesting art because you have more things to pull from. And so this is why I made that correlation between perspective and lenses. It's not like I reinvented the wheel. It's just like I just want to always investigate like how does this correlate between each other. And if we look at that correlation, again, this is inspired by the book Framed Perspective when it comes to these portraits, but it's a great example of what we see, right? We also see it in the movie examples that I gave you, is that when it comes to a wide angle, we always get like a lot of deformity in the subject matter because it's not a natural angle, especially for our eyes, right? It's not natural. Maybe a fly will find this natural because it has a wider angle view. I'm not necessarily sure, but there might be creatures that have a wide angle view. So this for them would be natural. For us, it's not, right? We're closer to the standard medium lens and we like the appeal of the long lens. And so how does that correlate to perspective? Well, if we translate it directly to perspective, what we see is that the wide angle lens, what it actually does, it has a lot of very fast conversions. So this usually is what we call the 5-point perspective, where there is both conversions on the horizontal lines, on the vertical lines, as well as towards the center, right? So this like 5-point perspective where we have basically conversions everywhere. There's a lot of fast conversions from every angle. And this creates that illusion of the wide angle lens. Whereas if we look at the standard or medium lens, this is more a Still a relatively fast conversions, but not on all fronts anymore. It's more about a 3-point perspective or a 2-point perspective. If we look at it in boxes terms, you can see that the wide angle will have a lot of very fast conversions, whereas the standard and medium lens will have faster conversions, but not as drastic as the wide angle. So not as warped, right? Because as soon as we apply perspective, like 3-point perspective, what you see here, this is very, very warped perspective. And this doesn't look natural to us. So when it comes to the standard or medium lens, this looks a lot more natural to us. And usually this means that we have somewhat of a fast convergence on one end, but a very slow convergence on the other, right? So same here, there will be some faster convergence towards a singular point closer to the horizon line than the other. And this is what creates more of the illusion of the standard or medium lens. It can still be 3-point, albeit lot less converging 3-point or 2-point perspective, where it's also there's one converging line or a guideline, but the other isn't converging that fast. And then when we look at the long lens, nothing is converging fast. Everything is slow convergence. That means that everything actually gets compressed. So our perspective guides or vanishing points are very wide apart. And this creates more of an illusion of the long lens effect. Or it could also be 1-point perspective, because 1-point perspective is literally there's no convergence on the horizon and just all convergence towards 1 point. And so that's the main difference in perspective when it comes to the wide angle versus standard and long. And this is actually something that you can really utilize in your own art. So if we then take a look at an example that I have here, right? This is a example of a wide angle lens. Now, this is actually from a real client brief that I had on the game Scarface, and it was basically we needed some type of Irish mobster sitting. He was a weapons dealer, obviously, and he was sitting in front of his table, explaining himself, blah, blah, blah. And there's not a client almost never, some will never give you like camera suggestions unless it's like very specific. I think maybe some developers really want that, especially when they want to put an emphasis on storytelling. But usually you have to come up with this, and that's why understanding camera lenses can be so effective. I knew that, okay, we need to understand that he's a weapons dealer, and we need to also have the weapons in the scene. We need to have information about the scene, and we also need to show that this guy is a bad guy and he's not well intended. So there also needs to be a focus on his personality, his character traits. So that means that I chose a wide angle lens because, well, I can do both of that. I can zoom in, so to speak, on the character, but I can also show everything else in the scene without losing detail. And this is why I use a wide angle. This is a 3-point perspective. It's not a fisheye perspective, but it's a 3-point perspective. So it's a relative wide angle for a relatively short frame. So I can show everything in the scene. Now, if we were to translate that to a standard medium lens, it wouldn't make sense to have this particular camera position. And the reason I say that is because remember that I said that the standard medium lens is particularly made to give the audience a feeling that they're participating in the scene. So if I were to choose a standard medium lens for this scene, I wouldn't choose this particular camera position because it's not really doing us any favors. Maybe if we want to show like we're hiding somewhere between boxes, like I could literally have drawn like boxes here that were blurry so that it feels like we're sneaking away and we're trying to look at the scene. But otherwise, if we want to really be part of the conversation, we would change that to something like this, where we feel like we're sitting at the table, like we are participating in this conversation. Like maybe he's talking to our associate and we're there as an associate also overhearing the conversation, so that it becomes more of a immersive illustration, not an informative illustration. And so this is the power of understanding lenses, that we can understand, like, if we want to evoke a certain emotion, I would opt for this lens versus this lens. And this is what a lot of beginning artists and even experienced artists really don't understand or invest enough time into, because it can really elevate your art. So what will we do for a long lens? Like, when would we use a long lens for this particular case? Well, if you remember, like I said, we use the long lens to have more of a graphical composition of the scene. So this would be like, we still maybe want to show emotion, or we want to just get a sort of really cool graphic shot of this bunker weaponry warehouse that he's in. We don't necessarily need to see a lot of his emotion. Well, then we could go in and we could have a shot like this, where it's like very graphic, and it's more about the composition. It's more like we're pointing things in a certain direction. So we're really positioning our camera in a certain way that the environment or the scene is helping us point us to the right focal point, because we still want to, look at this guy because he's the focal point, and then everything in between is still there to inform us, but it's more in a graphical way. So it's more in a cool, more graphically pleasing way. Now, what that also could do is then we can then use this as sort of what they call a sequential shot, and that we would zoom in on this character in the same sequence, and we still use a long lens, but now we really get a very close look on his face, but everything else will be blurry because, again, the focal length will be very close. So we'll get a really cool, graphically appealing, attractive like shot of his face. It will look cool. It will look very, very graphically pleasing, but we will lose everything else. It's at the expense of losing everything else. And so that's why directors and directors of photography, they play with lenses for storytelling, so that what is the emphasis of the story? What are we trying to tell? And as illustrators, or as maybe even concept artists, but especially as comic artists or as storyboarders, you need to understand the same thing. You need to understand what you're trying to communicate to your audience. So this understanding of lenses becomes very, very important. Okay, so if you want to practice this, right, and you have a good understanding of how to build figure and construct figures, because I wouldn't recommend that you do very graphic, loosey-goosey sketching and also trying to figure out what lens you're going to use, because we are correlating perspective to lenses. So I would say in the beginning, just build mannequins that you can put in a certain perspective. So for example, there's a workout that we did at Artwod where we have you put mannequins in a certain scene. We give you a brief, and then you build those mannequins. You don't worry about detail at all, but you worry about the lens that you're going to use, the story you want to tell. So in this case, I wanted to have a participating view, as in I'm sitting at the bar and I'm looking at these guys. The waiter is pouring them a drink, and I'm just witnessing them. So I'm part of the conversation, so to speak, or at least I'm eavesdropping. And that's how I built the mannequins. And then later you can go in and detail that, right? And so that would be your first steps into understanding, how do I tell a story? What's the outcome? What's the focus? What's the goal of the story that I'm trying to tell? How do I translate that into perspective? Where am I going to position my camera? How am I going to position my figures within that scene? And then you can go and detail that. And then you can try and do the exact same scene, but with a different storytelling focus, as in, we're not participating in this case. We just want to have like an informative view, or we want to have a very graphic, pleasing view. So you'll change to either a long lens or a wide angle lens. And by practicing this, you'll become much better at storytelling, because it will no longer be about how cool can I render my characters, but it will be about how can I convey the story that I want to convey, because rendering will be the least of your worries, and it will be the least of your audience's worries as well. It will be more about, am I evoking the emotion from my audience that I want? Not that, have I rendered this particular gold piece in the scene very nicely? So to recap, focus on understanding lenses first. Don't go into the scene building like this right away. Focus on understanding the correlation between wide angle lenses and perspective. You can come back to this video to understand what that relation looks like, and why we would use wide angle and why we would use standard and long lenses. Again, as a disclaimer, this is how I view these lenses, but they have helped me massively. I'm sure there's 1,000 different ways that you can combine this, but if you want to make your own category of why you would use wide angle and why you would use standard and why you would use long, then do that, but stick to it. Right? As I said it again, have an opinion, but then stick to that opinion. Have a conviction of why you're using certain things. This is my conviction, and I'm sure it can definitely help a lot of you get your first steps into storytelling and elevating your storytelling in your art. All right. As always, happy drawing and see you in the next one.